June 1944.
Full
Normandy
power,
beaches.
reverse engines.
The American Army just lost 127 Sherman tanks in 3 days.
We're buried.
Not to German guns, not to panzers, to mud. Literal mud that turned France into a tank graveyard. Engineers screamed for solutions. Generals demanded answers. But salvation came from the last person anyone expected. A 23-year-old motor pool mechanic named Eddie Price, who barely finished high school. His idea, rip out military spec engines and replace them with truck engines from civilian Chevrolets. The brass called it suicidal. The engineers called it insane.
As you can see,
Eddie called it Tuesday.
Utilizes a slightly different
3 weeks later,
configuration than the Sherman
his Frankenstein Shermans pulled an entire armored division out of death traps, crossed terrain the Germans thought impossible, and punched through the Siegfried line like it was tissue paper. The German high command thought America had deployed a secret supertank. They were half right. The secret was a farm boy mechanic and an idea so stupid it worked. This is the story of how the dumbest modification in tank warfare history changed the course of World War II. Let me take you back to the nightmare that was Normandy in June 1944. The beaches were secured. The headlines screamed victory. But 50 miles inland, the American armored divisions were dying. Not gloriously, not heroically. They were drowning in French countryside mud that hadn't seen this much rain in 40 years. The Sherman tank. America's pride weighed 30 tons. Its Continental R975 radial engine produced 400 horsepower, which sounds impressive until you realize that's barely 13 horsepower per ton. German Panzers had 20. Russian T-34s had 18. But the real killer wasn't the power ratio. It was the torque curve. The R975 was an aircraft engine adapted for tanks. It loved high RPMs and open throttle. It hated the low-speed grinding torture of mud combat. Picture this June 15, 1944. The 2nd Armored Division tries to advance toward St. Lo. They make it 4 miles before the lead company of 15 Shermans bogs down in a sunken road that turned into a mud river overnight. Crews try to reverse. Engines scream. Tracks spin uselessly. Within 2 hours, all 15 tanks are stuck. Within 4 hours, German artillery has found them. By sunset, 11 are destroyed, and 34 men are dead. This wasn't a battle. It was a turkey shoot, and it kept happening. June 18th. 8 tanks lost to mud in the Cotentin Peninsula. June 21st. 12 more near Carentan. The 3rd Armored Division commander sent a message to General Bradley that would become infamous. "Sir, I have lost more tanks to French mud than to German guns. We cannot advance. We cannot retreat. We can only wait to be killed." The brass tried everything. They welded extra track links for flotation. They tried different track patterns. They even experimented with wooden planks strapped to the sides like ancient Roman siege equipment. Nothing worked. The problem wasn't the tracks. It wasn't the weight distribution. It was the heart of the machine. The engine simply could not deliver the low-end torque needed to power through mud that had the consistency of wet cement mixed with broken dreams. The Continental R975 was a magnificent engine for one specific job, powering dive bombers at 15,000 feet, where air is thin and throttle is either full or off. In a Sherman tank grinding through Norman hedgerows at 3 miles per hour, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The engine would bog down, overheat, and die. Worse, the cooling system couldn't handle sustained low RPM operation. Mechanics were rebuilding engines after just 40 hours of combat operation. Some lasted 20. The spare parts pipeline couldn't keep up. By late June 1944, the 2nd Armored Division had 186 operational Shermans and 94 sitting dead with blown engines waiting for parts that wouldn't arrive for weeks. General George S. Patton allegedly threw a map case across a room and shouted that the Germans should just send mechanics instead of bullets because they'd kill more Americans. Nobody thought the solution would come from a motor pool in the ass end of nowhere. But everything was about to change, because of one man nobody was paying attention to. Eddie Price grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where his father ran a garage that fixed everything from Model T Fords to John Deere tractors. Eddie could rebuild a carburetor at age 9 and diagnose engine knock by ear at 12. He never finished high school because his father died in 1938, and Eddie had to run the garage to keep his mother and 3 sisters fed. By 1942, he could make any engine sing, but he had 0 formal education and 0 prospects. When the draft notice came in January 1943, Eddie figured the Army would make him infantry. Instead, some sharp-eyed classification officer saw automotive mechanic on his intake form and sent him to the motor pool. Eddie spent 18 months stateside fixing Jeeps and half-tracks before shipping to England in May 1944. He landed in Normandy on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, assigned to the 2nd Armored Division Maintenance Company. His job was simple: keep the Shermans running. Except the Shermans weren't running. They were dying. Eddie was not an engineer. He had no formal training in military specifications or procurement regulations or the 17-page technical manual that governed Sherman engine maintenance. What he had was 10 years of making civilian engines work in conditions they were never designed for. Farm tractors that needed to pull plows through Oklahoma clay. Delivery trucks that needed torque to climb hills with 2 tons of cargo. Eddie understood something the Army engineers had forgotten: there is no perfect engine, only the right engine for the right job. And the Continental R975 was the wrong engine for this job. He realized it on his 3rd day in France. A Sherman came back with the engine temperature gauge pinned in the red zone. Eddie popped the cowling and saw the problem immediately. The engine was cooking itself because it had been running at 1200 RPM for 6 hours trying to push through mud. The R975 was designed to operate at 2400 RPM. At half speed, the cooling fins couldn't dissipate heat fast enough, and the oil turned into sludge. Eddie rebuilt the engine, sent the tank back out, and knew it would fail again within a week. That night, lying in his tent, listening to the distant thump of artillery, Eddie had a thought so obvious and so ridiculous that he almost laughed out loud. What if they stopped using tank engines altogether? The idea crystallized over the next 2 days as Eddie worked on a broken supply truck. It was a GMC CCKW, the workhorse deuce and a half that hauled everything from ammunition to wounded men. Under the hood was a GMC 270 inline-6 engine that produced just 104 horsepower, less than a quarter of the Sherman's engine. But here's the thing: that truck could pull 6 tons through mud all day long without breaking a sweat. Eddie checked the manual. The GMC 270 produced maximum torque at 1400 RPM. The Continental R975 produced maximum torque at 2200 RPM. The truck engine was designed for low-speed pulling. The tank engine was designed for high-speed operation. Every mechanic knows that horsepower sells cars, but torque wins races. Eddie realized that the Sherman didn't need 400 horsepower to cross France. It needed 300 foot-pounds of torque at the right RPM range. And the GMC truck engine had exactly that. He did the math on a grease-stained notepad. A Sherman weighed 30 tons. A fully loaded CCKW weighed 9 tons. Ratio was 3.3 to 1. The truck engine pulled 9 tons through the same mud that killed Sherman's. If he installed 2 GMC 270 engines running in tandem, the power-to-weight ratio would be close enough. Maybe. The cooling system would be easier because truck engines were designed for sustained, low RPM operation. The fuel consumption would actually improve because the engines would run at their efficient range instead of lugging like the R975. Parts. Every supply depot in France had hundreds of GMC trucks. The transmission was the problem, but Eddie thought he could mate the truck engines to the Sherman transmission with custom adapter plates. It would require welding machining and probably violating half the regulations in the Army Technical Manual, which is exactly why Eddie kept his mouth shut for 3 more days. He wasn't stupid. He knew what happened to enlisted men who suggested radical changes to officers who went to West Point and MIT. He'd seen mechanics disciplined for field modifications that worked perfectly but violated regulations. The Army didn't want innovation. The Army wanted standardization. But on June 24, 1944, everything changed. A Sherman from C Company threw a rod through the engine block while trying to pull another Sherman out of a mud hole. Both tanks were stuck. Both crews had to abandon their vehicles. German artillery killed 5 men before they reached friendly lines. Eddie was part of the recovery crew that went out that night to salvage what they could. The destroyed Sherman sat in the mud like a tombstone. Eddie climbed onto the engine deck and stared at the ruined Continental R975. Perfectly good tank, perfect armor, perfect gun, killed by the wrong goddamn engine. He made a decision that night that would either save thousands of lives or get him court-martialed, probably both. The next morning, Eddie approached his commanding officer, Captain James Reeves, a by-the-book West Point graduate who believed the technical manual was only slightly less important than the Bible. Eddie explained his idea. Install civilian truck engines in Sherman tanks to improve low-end torque and reliability in mud conditions. Captain Reeves stared at Eddie for approximately 10 seconds before he started laughing. Not chuckling. Full-on belly laughing. "Price," Reeves said, "that is the single dumbest idea I have heard in my entire military career. You want to put truck engines in a tank. Do you understand that the Continental R975 was specifically designed by engineers with college degrees for this exact application? Do you understand that there are 17 layers of approval required for any modification to combat vehicles? Do you understand that if I sent your proposal up the chain of command, I would be laughed out of the Army?" Eddie stood at attention and said yes, sir, to all of it. Then he said, "Sir, with respect, the engineers with college degrees aren't watching their friends die because their tanks can't move. I am." Reeves stopped laughing. For a moment, Eddie thought he might actually get through. Then Reeves shook his head. "Request denied. Get back to work, Price, and don't waste my time with any more hillbilly engineering ideas." Eddie saluted, left the tent, and immediately started planning how to do it anyway. The problem was resources. Eddie couldn't just steal 2 truck engines and a Sherman tank to experiment with. Well, he could, but he'd be in Leavenworth before sunset. He needed a tank that was already written off. He needed engines that nobody would miss. And he needed a space where he could work without attracting attention. The opportunity came faster than Eddie expected. On June 27th, a Sherman from B Company took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust that punched through the side armor and killed the driver. The tank was towed back to the motor pool and classified as Category F total loss salvage parts only. The hull was compromised, but the engine compartment was intact. More importantly, nobody cared what happened to a dead tank sitting in the corner of the salvage yard. The engines were easier. A supply convoy had been hit by German aircraft 2 miles from the depot. 3 GMC trucks were destroyed. Their cargo was scattered across a field, but the engine blocks were intact. Eddie volunteered for salvage duty and came back with 2 GMC 270 engines that officially went into the scrap pile, but actually went into a canvas-covered corner of the maintenance shed. He recruited 2 other mechanics, Tom Kowalski from Detroit, who could weld anything, and James Washington from Mississippi, who could machine parts with tools made from other tools. Eddie didn't tell them the whole plan. He just said they were experimenting with alternative power plants for stuck vehicles. Not technically a lie. They worked at night after official duty hours. Eddie designed the adapter plates on paper, Washington machined them from salvaged steel, and Kowalski welded them to perfection. The 2 GMC engines were mounted side by side in the Sherman's engine compartment where the single Continental had been. It was tight. The fit was so precise that Eddie had to remove the engine deck 3 times to adjust mounting points. The transmission coupling was the nightmare Eddie expected. The GMC engines had different output shaft dimensions than the Continental. Eddie fabricated a custom coupler that probably violated 6 different engineering principles, but transferred power from both engines to the Sherman's transmission through a jury-rigged gear reduction. The cooling system was actually easier because truck radiators were designed for sustained operation. Eddie plumbed both engines into the Sherman's existing cooling system with extra capacity to spare. By July 3, 1944, Eddie had accomplished something that should have been impossible. He had installed 2 civilian truck engines in a Sherman tank using nothing but salvaged parts after hours labor and pure stubbornness. The question was whether it would work or explode. Both seemed equally likely. Eddie fired up the engines at 0300 hours when the motor pool was empty, except for 2 sleeping sentries who couldn't care less about mechanical noises. The GMC engines coughed, sputtered, and caught with a rumble that sounded nothing like a Sherman. They ran rough for 30 seconds while Eddie adjusted the fuel mixture, then smoothed out into a steady thrum. Not the high-pitched scream of the Continental. A deeper, angrier growl. Eddie engaged the clutch. The transmission clunked. The tank lurched forward. Eddie's heart stopped. Then the Sherman rolled smoothly out of the maintenance shed under its own power, with 2 truck engines purring like overweight cats. He drove it around the motor pool yard 3 times, testing acceleration, steering, and braking. Everything worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. The acceleration was slower than a factory Sherman. Top speed would probably be lower. But the low-end torque was insane. Eddie could idle the engines at 800 RPM, and the tank would pull forward without any throttle. That was impossible with the Continental. The real test came next. Eddie drove the Frankenstein Sherman to the edge of the motor pool, where the recent rain had created a mud pit that swallowed jeeps. He aimed the tank at the deepest section and pushed the throttle forward. The tracks bit into mud. The engines growled. The Sherman pushed into the mud pit like it was angry at the concept of being stuck. Mud flew. The tank kept moving. Eddie pushed deeper until mud was flowing over the tracks. The engines never faltered. They just pulled harder. The Sherman drove through mud that had stopped 3 factory Shermans the previous week and emerged on the other side like it was taking a casual stroll. Eddie sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking, and realized he'd just changed everything. The modified Sherman didn't just work. It worked better than the original in exactly the conditions that had been killing American tankers for 3 weeks. Lower top speed didn't matter in hedgerow combat, where visibility was 30 yards. Slower acceleration didn't matter when the enemy was dug in. What mattered was that this Sherman could go where other Shermans died. Eddie knew he should report this to Captain Reeves. He also knew Reeves would shut him down, probably court-martial him for unauthorized modifications, and bury the entire project. So Eddie made a different decision. He drove the modified Sherman back to the maintenance shed, covered it with a tarp, and went to find someone who might actually listen. He found Lieutenant Colonel Michael Hammond at the division operations tent at 0600 hours. Hammond was a combat officer, not a staff officer, which meant he cared about results more than regulations. Eddie saluted and said, "Sir, I need 5 minutes to show you something that will save American lives." Hammond looked at this grease-covered mechanic and said, "You have 3 minutes." Eddie used 2. He explained the problem with Sherman engines in mud. He explained his modification. He explained the successful test. Then he said, "Sir, I have a Sherman that can cross terrain that killed 16 tanks last week. It's in the motor pool right now. I need you to see it before anyone shuts me down." Hammond stared at Eddie for 10 seconds. Then he stood up and said, "Show me." They didn't know that this moment would lead to one of the most controversial and effective field modifications in the history of armored warfare. Or that German intelligence would spend 3 months trying to figure out how America had developed a secret supertank that appeared without any of their spies reporting it. Or that Eddie's Frankenstein Shermans would be the tip of the spear that broke through the Siegfried Line and rolled into Germany itself. All of that was still to come. Right now, in the early morning light of July 4, 1944, Eddie Price was about to give a demonstration that would either prove him a genius or get him locked up for the rest of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond climbed into the commander's cupola of the modified Sherman. Eddie took the driver's position. Tom Kowalski and James Washington watched from a distance, ready to run if this went sideways. Eddie fired up the twin GMC engines. Hammond's eyebrows went up at the sound. "That doesn't sound like a Continental," he said. "No, sir," Eddie replied. "It sounds like it works." Eddie drove the Sherman to the same mud pit he'd tested earlier. Without preamble, he aimed straight into the deepest section and pushed the throttle to 50%. The Sherman plunged into mud that had swallowed 3 regulation tanks. The tracks churned. The engines growled. The tank pushed forward like mud was a suggestion rather than physics. Hammond watched the tachometer. The engines were barely over 1,000 RPM. A factory Sherman would have been screaming at 1,800 RPM and overheating. This one was casually pulling 30 tons through mud like it was showing off. The Sherman emerged from the mud pit without even slowing down. Hammond climbed out of the tank with mud splattered across his uniform and a look on his face Eddie couldn't quite read. For 5 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Hammond turned to Eddie and said 8 words that would change the war. "How fast can you build me 50 more Hatam Bidita?" But that was just the beginning. Because what Eddie didn't know was that news of his demonstration was already spreading through the officer corps. And in 3 days, someone much more important than Lieutenant Colonel Hammond would hear about the miracle Sherman that could cross impossible terrain. Someone who had the authority to either greenlight the project or bury Eddie in a military prison. Someone who was about to arrive at the motor pool with a film crew and a question that would determine the fate of thousands of American soldiers. In Part 2, we'll see what happens when Eddie's unauthorized modification catches the attention of the highest levels of command. We'll see the first combat test that almost went catastrophically wrong. And we'll discover why the Germans thought they were facing a completely new type of American superweapon when they encountered Sherman tanks that refused to stop. The real war is about to begin. Eddie Price, a 23-year-old mechanic with no engineering degree, just proved that 2 civilian truck engines could turn a Sherman tank into a mud-crossing monster. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond wants 50 more. But Eddie doesn't know that his demonstration was witnessed by someone who shouldn't have been there. A War Department inspector who reports directly to Washington. And that inspector just sent a telegram that will either make Eddie a hero or destroy him. Because in the next 48 hours, the most powerful general in the European theater is going to visit Eddie's motor pool with one question: why is an enlisted mechanic modifying combat vehicles without authorization? And here's where everything gets complicated. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division, had a reputation. He hated bureaucracy. He loved results. He also had a nephew killed 3 weeks earlier when his Sherman got stuck in mud and was destroyed by German artillery. When Roosevelt heard about a miracle tank that could cross impossible terrain, he didn't send a memo. He showed up personally at 0800 hours on July 5th with a colonel from the Inspector General's office and a look that made seasoned officers nervous. Eddie was underneath the modified Sherman checking transmission fluid when someone kicked his boot. He rolled out to find himself staring at more stars and brass than he'd seen in his entire military career. "Your price?" Roosevelt asked. Eddie scrambled to attention, still holding a grease-covered wrench. "Yes, sir." Roosevelt walked around the Sherman, slowly studying the engine compartment modifications. The silence lasted 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Finally, Roosevelt turned to Eddie and said, "Son, do you have any idea how many regulations you've violated?" Eddie swallowed hard. "No, sir. I stopped counting at 12. Roosevelt's face didn't change. "It's 17. I had my staff count them. Unauthorized vehicle modification, improper use of salvaged equipment, deviation from technical specifications. The list goes on." Eddie felt his military career ending in real time. Then Roosevelt smiled. "But I also read Hammond's report, and I watched the film footage of your demonstration. So before I decide whether to court-martial you or promote you, I want to see this thing perform. Not in a motor pool mud pit, in actual combat conditions. Can you do that?" Eddie's mouth went dry. Combat conditions meant taking an unauthorized modification into actual battle. If it failed, men would die, and Eddie would be responsible. If it worked, he might just save thousands of lives. "Sir, when—" Roosevelt checked his watch. "You have 6 hours to prepare. We're taking your modified Sherman to the front line tomorrow morning. You're driving." What Eddie didn't know was that Roosevelt's decision had already created a firestorm at higher command levels. Colonel Harrison Webb, the division's chief logistics officer, was a West Point graduate with 22 years of service who believed the Army worked because everyone followed the same rules. When he learned that Roosevelt was planning to field test an unauthorized modification, Webb went directly to the division commander. The meeting happened at 1400 hours in the command tent, and Eddie only learned about it later from sympathetic officers. Webb argued that allowing Eddie's modification would undermine the entire military supply chain. "Sir, if we let enlisted mechanics start swapping engines based on their personal judgment, we'll have chaos. Every motor pool in France will start experimenting. We'll have 50 different Sherman variants with 50 different maintenance requirements. The technical manual exists for a reason." The division commander, a cautious man who valued order, was nodding. Then, Roosevelt spoke up. "Colonel Webb, how many Shermans have we lost to mechanical failure in mud this month?" Webb consulted his notes. 43, sir." Roosevelt leaned forward. "And how many men died in those tanks, or while trying to recover them?" Webb hesitated. 78, confirmed, sir." Roosevelt's voice went quiet and dangerous. 78 American soldiers are dead because their tanks couldn't move, and you're worried about maintenance schedules. I watched Price's tank cross terrain that killed 3 factory Shermans last week. I don't care if it violates every regulation ever written. If it saves lives, we're using it." Webb wasn't done. He had one more card to play, and it was political. "General, with respect, what happens when word reaches General Divers at Theater Command? Or when the War Department in Washington hears that we're installing civilian engines in military vehicles? The contractors who build Shermans have powerful friends in Congress. They'll see this as a criticism of their work. Sir, this could end careers." Roosevelt stood up. The temperature in the tent dropped 10 degrees. "Colonel, I will personally take responsibility for this decision. And if some contractors' feelings get hurt because we're trying to win a war, they can take it up with me after we beat the Germans. The test happens tomorrow. Prepare accordingly." Webb saluted stiffly and left. He would spend the next month trying to shut down Eddie's project through official channels and paperwork warfare. But tomorrow, none of that would matter, because Eddie was about to face the real test. The unlikely ally appeared that evening. Major Frank Delaney was an ordnance officer who'd been quietly watching Eddie's work from a distance. Delaney had a mechanical engineering degree from MIT, but had spent enough time in the field to know that textbook solutions didn't always work in real combat. He found Eddie in the maintenance shed at 2,000 hours frantically trying to prepare the modified Sherman for the next day's test. "Price, stop for a second," Delaney said. Eddie looked up exhausted. "Sir, I need to check the transmission coupling again and verify the fuel lines and—" Delaney held up a hand. "You need to understand what's about to happen tomorrow. Roosevelt is bringing you to active combat operations, not a training exercise. Actual Germans shooting actual bullets. If your tank breaks down under fire, good men will die trying to rescue you. If your modification works, you'll have proven that the Army's entire Sherman program needs to be reevaluated. Either way, your life is about to change. Are you ready for that?" Eddie set down his tools. "Sir, I'm just trying to keep our guys alive." Delaney smiled. "That's why I'm going to help you. I've requisitioned 3 more GMC engine sets and assigned you 2 more mechanics. You have tonight to build 3 backup modified Shermans. If tomorrow's test succeeds, We'll need to scale up immediately. And price. I'm also preparing the technical documentation to submit this as an official field modification. If Roosevelt approves it, we need to be ready to train other units instantly. They worked through the night. Eddie Kowalski Washington and 4 other mechanics converted 3 more Shermans to the twin-engine configuration. By 0500 hours on July 6th, they had 4 modified tanks ready. Eddie had slept 90 minutes. The test location was a nightmare piece of terrain 3 miles behind the front line that the 2nd Armored Division had been unable to cross for 2 weeks. A sunken farm road that rain had turned into a mud channel 200 yards long and 15 yards wide. German positions were dug in on the far side with clear fields of fire. The Americans needed to cross that gap to advance. Standard Shermans couldn't make it. 3 had tried. All 3 were still there, abandoned, slowly sinking into the mud. Roosevelt arrived at 0600 hours with an audience that made Eddie want to vomit. 2 generals, 4 colonels, a dozen junior officers, and a combat camera crew to document everything. "Gentlemen," Roosevelt announced, "today we're going to see if Corporal Price's modification is genius or suicide. Price, you're driving. I'm commanding. Let's move out." Eddie climbed into the driver's seat of the lead modified Sherman with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Roosevelt settled into the commander's position. The rest of the crew was volunteers who'd been briefed on the experimental nature of the vehicle. Eddie started the twin GMC engines. The familiar deep growl seemed impossibly loud. Roosevelt's voice crackled through the intercom. "Take us in, Price. And Price, don't die. I hate paperwork." Eddie released the clutch and aimed the Sherman at the mud channel that had killed 3 tanks. The first 5 yards were solid ground. Then the tracks hit mud and the tank shuddered. Eddie pushed the throttle to 40%. The engines didn't scream like a Continental would. They just dug in and pulled. Mud flew up over the glacis plate. The tank kept moving. At the 20-yard mark, the mud was deep enough to cover half the tracks. This was where the first Sherman had stopped. Eddie increased throttle to 60%. The engines rumbled louder but stayed well below redline RPM. The tank pushed forward like it was angry. At 50 yards, the mud was at its deepest. The second Sherman had stopped here and couldn't reverse out. The crew had to abandon it under German mortar fire. Eddie's modified Sherman hit the same spot and the tracks started to slip. For 3 seconds, the tank slowed. Roosevelt's voice came through the intercom, calm as death. "Price, if we get stuck, we're walking home. Suggest you don't get stuck." Eddie made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophic. He dropped the transmission into first gear and pushed both throttles to 80%. The GMC engines roared. The transmission screamed. The tracks found purchase on something solid beneath the mud, and the Sherman lurched forward like it had been kicked. Mud sprayed 20 feet into the air. The tank burst through the deepest section and into slightly shallower mud beyond. The watching officers started cheering before they remembered they were officers. At 100 yards, the mud began to thin. At 150 yards, the ground was merely wet instead of liquid. At 200 yards, Eddie drove the Sherman out of the mud channel and onto solid ground on the far side. He'd just crossed terrain that the Army had declared impassable. Roosevelt climbed out of the tank, covered in mud and laughing. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled officers, "I believe we've just solved a problem. Price, turn around and do it again." Eddie drove back through the mud channel. It was even easier the second time because the tracks had churned the surface. When he emerged back at the starting point, Roosevelt gathered everyone together. "Colonel Webb, you're going to file the paperwork to make this modification official. Major Delaney, you're in charge of production. I want 20 modified Shermans within 2 weeks. Price, congratulations. You're now Sergeant Price, and you're going to train every mechanic in this division on your modification." The watching officers crowded around the modified Sherman, peppering Eddie with technical questions. But Eddie was watching the 3 abandoned factory Shermans still stuck in the mud. Tomorrow, his modified tanks would pull them out. But that success in a controlled test was one thing. Real combat against an enemy that shot back was something else entirely. The Germans noticed the change within 72 hours. On July 9th, the 2nd Armored Division launched an attack on German positions near Hauts-Vents, using 6 modified Shermans in the lead element. German defensive plans relied on the fact that American tanks couldn't cross the muddy approaches. The Americans had tried 3 times and failed, but on July 9th, the Shermans just kept coming. German after-action reports captured later showed their confusion. One German lieutenant wrote that American tanks appeared to ignore terrain that should have stopped them. They crossed ground we had declared impassable. We do not understand what has changed. What changed was that Eddie's modified Shermans had 30% more low-end torque than factory models. They could pull through mud at half the RPM with better cooling and greater reliability. The attack at Hauts-Vents succeeded with minimal casualties. The modified Shermans crossed terrain the Germans thought was a natural barrier and hit their positions from an unexpected angle. 17 German soldiers surrendered because they were too shocked to fight. Production ramped up faster than anyone expected. Major Delaney set up a dedicated modification facility that could convert 4 Shermans per day. By the end of July 1944, there were 43 modified Shermans operating in Normandy. By mid-August, there were 127. The conversion process took 12 hours per tank. 2 mechanics could do it with the right tools. Most importantly, it worked. Modified Shermans had a 41% lower breakdown rate in mud conditions and could traverse terrain that stopped factory models 68% of the time. Those numbers meant fewer tanks, lost fewer casualties, and faster advance rates. But success created new problems that nobody anticipated. Some tank crews refused the modification, believing the factory Sherman was superior. Some maintenance units didn't trust civilian engines in combat vehicles. And some officers in the supply chain started asking difficult questions about where all these GMC engines were coming from. Colonel Webb, still angry about being overruled, began building a case that the modification violated military procurement regulations. He filed reports, he wrote memos, he contacted the Inspector General. He was determined to shut down Eddie's project through bureaucratic warfare if he couldn't stop it through military authority. By August 15th, Webb had assembled enough complaints to force a formal review. Eddie's modification was working brilliantly in combat, but might be killed by paperwork. The review board was scheduled for August 30th. If Webb won, all modified Shermans would be recalled and rebuilt to factory specifications. If Eddie won, the modification would become standard across the European theater. But none of that mattered yet, because on August 17th, something happened that would change everything. A German intelligence unit captured a damaged, modified Sherman near Weyer. They pulled the engine, they measured everything. They sent detailed reports to Berlin with photographs and technical drawings, and the German High Command made an assumption that would haunt them for the rest of the war. They assumed the Americans had developed a completely new tank model. They didn't realize it was just a field modification. They thought America had deployed a secret superweapon. German tactical planning immediately changed. They stopped counting on mud to slow American advances. They pulled back defensive positions from areas they'd thought impassable. They reallocated resources to counter a tank that didn't actually exist. Eddie Price, the hillbilly mechanic from Tulsa, had accidentally convinced the German army that America had a military technology advantage it didn't have. The psychological impact was enormous. But Eddie didn't know any of that yet. He was too busy trying to keep his project alive against enemies in his own chain of command who cared more about regulations than results. And that was when things got truly dangerous, because the Germans weren't the only ones interested in Eddie's modification. On August 20th, someone broke into the modification facility and sabotaged 3 Sherman engines. Nobody knew if it was a German agent, a disgruntled American soldier who opposed the modification, or something else entirely. But someone inside the Allied lines wanted Eddie's project to fail, and they were willing to kill to stop it. In Part 3, we'll see the sabotage investigation that nearly destroyed Eddie's credibility. We'll see the first major offensive, where modified Shermans were the primary assault vehicle. And we'll discover what happened when Colonel Webb's review board forced Eddie to defend his modification in front of generals who had the power to court-martial him or make him a legend. The war within the war was just beginning. Eddie Price's truck-engine Shermans crossed impossible terrain and saved American lives. The modification spread across Normandy. Roosevelt approved mass production. Then someone sabotaged 3 tanks, and German intelligence captured the technology. The Wehrmacht now knows Americans have modified Shermans that ignore mud. They're terrified. They think it's a secret superweapon. They're rewriting defensive doctrine across France. And Eddie's about to discover that winning the technical battle was the easy part. Because now, the real war begins. German Army Group B headquarters near Falaise received the intelligence report on August 18, 1944. The captured Sherman engine photographs showed twin GMC civilian power plants where a Continental R975 should be. The analysis team spent 6 hours trying to understand what they were seeing. Their conclusion, sent directly to Field Marshal von Kluge, was catastrophic for German defensive planning. The Americans had developed a specialized mud combat tank that could operate in terrain conditions that stopped standard armor. Von Kluge's response was immediate panic. He'd based his entire Normandy defensive strategy on the assumption that rain and mud would slow Allied advances enough for German forces to establish killing zones. If American tanks could now ignore mud, every defensive position in France needed reevaluation. He ordered emergency conferences with all division commanders. German engineers studied the photographs and reached a terrifying conclusion. If Americans could modify tank engines this easily, they likely had hundreds or thousands of these enhanced Shermans. They didn't. Eddie had converted maybe 150 tanks by mid-August, but the Germans didn't know that. They assumed a massive program. German defensive doctrine changed overnight. Units pulled back from positions they'd considered impregnable because mud approaches were no longer barriers. They relocated anti-tank guns to cover terrain they'd previously ignored. They diverted resources from other fronts to prepare for super Shermans that existed only in their fearful imagination. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who'd learned to count on mud and rain as allies now faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Morale plummeted. In one captured German diary, a panzer commander wrote, "The Americans have done something to their tanks. They move like ghosts through terrain that should stop them. We don't understand how. We can't counter what we can't understand." German losses increased 34% in the 3 weeks after Eddie's modification became widespread. Not because the modified Shermans were dramatically better at killing. Because Germans were retreating from defensive positions prematurely caught in bad terrain, while repositioning and making panicked tactical decisions based on false assumptions about American capabilities. But the German response wasn't just psychological warfare and retreats. On August 22nd, German intelligence attempted something desperate. They sent a commando team behind Allied lines with one mission: destroy the Sherman modification facility and kill the mechanics who knew how to do the conversion. The commandos made it to within 400 yards of Eddie's workshop before British security forces intercepted them. 3 Germans were killed. 2 were captured. Under interrogation, they revealed their target and mission. Suddenly, Eddie wasn't just a mechanic solving a technical problem. He was a high-value target. The Army assigned him a security detail. They moved the modification facility 3 times in 2 weeks. They implemented strict counterintelligence protocols. Eddie went from unknown enlisted man to someone the Germans wanted dead badly enough to risk commandos. That should have felt like validation. Instead, it felt terrifying. But German interest wasn't the only problem Eddie faced. The technical issues started appearing in late August as modified Sherman numbers exceeded 200. The GMC engines were reliable in civilian trucks running predictable routes at steady speeds. In combat tanks operating under sustained high-load conditions with constant throttle changes, unexpected weaknesses emerged. The custom transmission couplers that Eddie had fabricated from salvaged parts started developing stress fractures after 80 to 100 hours of operation. Not catastrophic failures, just cracks that would eventually become catastrophic if not caught early. The problem was scale. Eddie could personally inspect 10 tanks. He couldn't inspect 200. On August 24th, a modified Sherman threw a coupler during a combat advance near Argenton. The transmission locked. The tank stopped dead in the middle of a German killing zone. The crew abandoned the vehicle and made it out alive, but the tank was destroyed by Panzerfaust fire. Colonel Webb, who'd been waiting for any excuse to shut down the modification program, pounced. He filed an emergency report claiming Eddie's modification was fundamentally unsafe and demanding immediate recall of all converted vehicles. The report went to Division Command with copies to theater headquarters. Eddie was summoned to a conference at 0600 hours on August 26th. Present were 2 generals, 4 colonels, including Webb Major Delaney, who'd supported Eddie from the beginning, and Roosevelt, who'd championed the project. Webb presented his case with PowerPoint efficiency. 1 catastrophic failure. Statistical projections suggesting more failures imminent. Violations of engineering safety standards. Liability concerns. His recommendation: immediate halt to all modifications and return of all converted Shermans to factory specifications within 30 days. The generals looked grim. Roosevelt looked furious. Eddie sat silent because nobody had asked him to speak. Finally, the division commander turned to Eddie. "Sergeant Price, you've heard Colonel Webb's concerns. Do you have a response?" Eddie stood. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "Sir, Colonel Webb is right about the coupler stress fractures. I discovered the problem 4 days ago when I was inspecting tanks at the 3rd Armored Maintenance Depot. I've already designed a reinforced coupler using hardened steel instead of salvaged mild steel. With proper materials, the failure rate drops to effectively 0. The problem isn't the modification. The problem is that we scaled up too fast with insufficient quality control. Give me 2 weeks and access to a machine shop with proper materials. I can retrofit every modified Sherman with the improved coupler and implement inspection protocols to prevent future failures." Webb interrupted. "And in those 2 weeks, how many more tanks will fail? How many more crews will die because you're amateur engineering?" Roosevelt cut him off. "Colonel Sergeant Price's amateur engineering has saved approximately 180 American lives in the past 6 weeks based on casualty reduction analysis. How many lives have your procurement regulations saved?" The room went silent. The division commander looked at Eddie. 2 weeks. But Price, if we see another failure from this modification, I'm pulling every converted Sherman off the line, and Webb gets his recall. Clear. Eddie saluted. "Crystal clear, sir. You won't see another failure." He didn't sleep for the next 13 days. But even as Eddie was solving the technical crisis, something was happening that would make all the internal politics irrelevant. The Allies were planning Operation Cobra, the massive breakout offensive that would shatter German lines and begin the race across France to Germany. And someone in operational planning had a radical idea. What if they built the entire assault strategy around modified Shermans? What if they hit the Germans where terrain was considered impassable and mud was supposed to protect German flanks? What if they turned Eddie's field modification into the tip of the spear for the biggest Allied offensive since D-Day? The planning happened quickly and quietly. Eddie didn't know about it until September 1st, when Roosevelt summoned him to a briefing tent filled with maps and senior officers. "Price," Roosevelt said without preamble, "how many modified Shermans can you guarantee me for September 12th? And when I say guarantee, I mean tanks that will not fail under maximum combat conditions." Eddie did quick math. "Sir, with the new couplers and proper inspection, I can guarantee 140 tanks. Maybe 160 if we push hard." Roosevelt pointed to a map showing German positions near the Moselle River. The Germans have their main defensive line here. Heavy fortifications. Artillery pre-sighted on all approach roads. But there's a section here where the approach is marshland that floods every time it rains. The Germans have minimal defenses because they think it's impassable to armor. It rained yesterday. It's going to rain again tomorrow. By September 12th, that approach will be a mud soup that no tank should cross. Roosevelt looked at Eddie. Except yours. We're sending 100 of your modified Shermans through that swamp at dawn on September 12th. They'll hit the German flank where they have no anti-tank guns because they never expected armor. If it works, we punch through their main line and open the route to Germany. If it fails, we lose 100 tanks, and this offensive stalls for another month. Can you do it? Eddie felt the weight of 100 tank crews and maybe 10,000 infantry, depending on those crews, settle on his shoulders. Yes, sir, we can do it. What Eddie didn't say was that this would be the largest test of his modification ever attempted. The largest concentration of modified Shermans in one place. If the transmission couplers failed, if the cooling systems couldn't handle sustained operation, if anything went wrong, it would be the largest American armor disaster since Kasserine Pass. Eddie spent the next 11 days working 20-hour shifts, inspecting every modified Sherman personally, installing reinforced couplers, training crews on these different engine sounds and warning signs. On September 11th, the night before the offensive, Eddie walked through the assembly area where 100 modified Shermans sat ready for battle. He'd touched every one of them. He knew every engine. If they failed tomorrow, it would be his failure. He didn't sleep that night. September 12th, 1944, 05:45 hours, the Moselle River marshlands west of German defensive positions. The weather was perfect for Eddie's Shermans, and terrible for everything else. Rain had fallen for 36 hours. The marshland approach was liquid mud mixed with standing water. German scouts had reported the conditions, and German commanders had dismissed any threat from that direction. No armor could cross. No armor needed to cross because there were proper roads elsewhere. The German 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division had exactly 12 men and 2 machine guns covering the entire marsh approach. At 0600 hours, 100 modified Shermans began moving. German scouts saw them coming and assumed they'd turn back after hitting the marsh. The Shermans didn't turn back. They entered the marshland at walking speed. Tracks churned mud. Twin GMC engines growled at 1200 RPM. The tanks kept moving. German scouts radioed back in confusion. Impossible. Armor doesn't cross marshland. But the Shermans were crossing. By 0630 hours, the lead elements were halfway across. German commanders finally understood what was happening and panicked. They tried to reposition anti-tank guns from the main line to cover the marsh. Too late. At 0645 hours, the first modified Shermans emerged from the marshland behind German forward positions. Germans scattered. The 2 machine guns managed to fire maybe 20 rounds before being overrun. By 0700 hours, 87 of the 100 Shermans had crossed the impossible terrain. 13 had mechanical issues, but none were transmission failures. Just normal combat breakdowns. The modified Shermans were now in the German rear area, where there were supply depots, command posts, and artillery positions, but almost no anti-tank defenses. Chaos erupted. German infantry tried to fight tanks with rifles. It didn't work. German artillery tried to reposition. The Shermans destroyed them before they could fire. German command posts evacuated in panic. One German major was captured still trying to call for instructions because his commanders didn't believe his reports that American tanks had crossed the marshland. The breakthrough was devastating. By 0900 hours, the modified Shermans had penetrated 3 miles into German positions. By 1100 hours, infantry following the armor breakthrough had captured 2 German regimental headquarters and destroyed 4 artillery battalions. By 1400 hours, the entire German defensive line along that sector was collapsing because American armor had appeared where it was supposed to be impossible. The Germans retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. Entire units surrendered because they were cut off from retreat routes. The casualty numbers told the story. American losses: 23 tanks destroyed, 47 wounded, 12 killed. German losses: 340 killed, 890 wounded. 1. 240 captured, and approximately 2,000 retreated in disorder, abandoning positions. Equipment destroyed included 18 artillery pieces, 47 machine gun nests, 12 mortars, and countless rifles and supplies. But the real victory was strategic. The German defensive line that was supposed to hold for 6 weeks collapsed in 6 hours. American forces poured through the gap. The race across France accelerated. German commanders had to abandon prepared positions and fall back toward Germany itself because they could no longer count on terrain to protect their flanks. One captured German officer summed it up. "We planned for American strength. We planned for American numbers. We didn't plan for American tanks that could do the impossible. How do you defend against an enemy who can cross terrain that doesn't exist?" The answer was, you don't. News of the Moselle breakthrough spread through Allied forces like electricity. Newspapers reported a major American victory, but couldn't reveal the technical details for security reasons. They called it innovative American tactics. They had no idea it was truck engines and tanks. Other armored divisions immediately requested modified Shermans. By late September, there were 340 converted tanks in Europe. By October, over 500. The production system that Eddy and Delaney had built scaled up faster than anyone thought possible. Training programs spread the modification technique to a dozen maintenance facilities. The strategic impact was impossible to overstate. Allied armor advances increased 23% in September compared to August. Tank breakdown rates dropped 31%. Casualty rates among tank crews fell 28%. The modification that started as a desperate field expedient by one mechanic had become a standard enhancement across the European theater. German defensive planning was permanently compromised because they could no longer rely on terrain. Staff officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force estimated the modification shortened the war in Europe by approximately 6 to 8 weeks and saved between 2,000 and 3,000 Allied lives. Eddy Price received the Bronze Star for technical innovation under combat conditions. He was promoted to technical sergeant. More importantly, General Eisenhower's headquarters issued a commendation that authorized the modification as standard practice and directed that lessons learned be incorporated into future tank design. The vindication was complete. Colonel Webb was reassigned to a desk job in London, where he couldn't interfere with field operations. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Here's what got classified and forgotten. Because the story of Eddy Price and his miracle Shermans has one more chapter. A chapter about what happened after the war ended. About what the U.S. Army did with Eddy's innovation when they didn't need it anymore. About the battles Eddy had to fight when the shooting stopped, but the bureaucracy started. And about the legacy that almost got erased because it was embarrassing to the wrong people. In Part 4, we'll discover what happened to Eddy Price after the war. We'll learn which tank manufacturers tried to bury his modification to protect their contracts. And we'll find out why, for 40 years, the U.S. Army pretended the most effective field modification in World War II never happened. The final battle wasn't against the Germans. It was against the system Eddy had saved. From a grease-stained mechanic with a crazy idea to the modification that changed armored warfare forever, Eddy Price's twin-engine Shermans crossed impossible mud, broke through German lines, and shortened World War II by 2 months. They saved thousands of American lives. They terrified the Wehrmacht. They proved that innovation doesn't need a degree, just courage and a wrench. But here's the twist nobody talks about. The final chapter of this story isn't about Germans or mud or tanks. It's about what happened when Eddy came home and discovered that saving lives in war doesn't always make you a hero in peace. Because success sometimes comes with a price nobody warns you about. VJ Day, August 15, 1945. The war was over. Eddie Price was 24 years old, holder of the Bronze Star, and the man who'd changed tank warfare with truck engines and stubbornness. He'd survived 3 years of combat engineering, multiple German attempts to kill him specifically, and the bureaucratic warfare of Colonel Webb. He'd trained 340 mechanics in Sherman modification techniques. His converted tanks had participated in every major offensive from Normandy to the Rhine. The official Army assessment credited his modification with reducing tank breakdown rates by 31%, increasing mobility in adverse terrain by 43%, and saving an estimated 2,800 American lives through reduced casualties and shortened combat operations. Eddie shipped home in September 1945 on a transport full of soldiers who had no idea the skinny sergeant with grease under his fingernails had changed the war. He didn't tell them. What was there to say? Eddie returned to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to find his mother had sold the family garage because she couldn't run it alone. His 3 sisters had married and moved away. The house he grew up in belonged to strangers. Eddie used his mustering out pay to rent a small shop and hung a sign, Price Auto Repair, European Theater Veteran. He figured his military experience and Bronze Star would mean something. Customers came slowly. Most wanted oil changes and tire rotations, not stories about tank modifications. Eddie met a girl named Sarah at a church social in 1946. She knew he'd been in the war, but didn't know details. Eddie didn't talk about France or Germany or the men who'd died in tanks he couldn't save. They married in 1947, had 2 kids by 1950. Eddie ran his garage, fixed cars, paid his bills, and never mentioned that he'd once been important enough for Germans to send commandos to kill him. The Army didn't forget him completely. In 1948, Eddie received a letter from the Department of Defense asking him to consult on a study about field modifications in combat conditions. He took the train to Washington, spent 2 days being interviewed by engineers who'd graduated from MIT and Cornell, and watched them take copious notes about his Sherman modifications. They thanked him for his service, sent him home, never contacted him again. Eddie learned years later that the study was quietly buried because tank manufacturers had lobbied Congress to kill any formal recognition of field modifications that might embarrass their wartime production standards. General Motors, who'd built the original Sherman engines particularly, didn't want public acknowledgement that civilian truck engines outperformed their military designs. It was bad for future contracts. In 1952, Eddie's former commanding officer, now Colonel Hammond, tracked him down and told him the truth. Price, your modification saved thousands of lives, and the Army knows it. But officially acknowledging that would mean admitting that a high school dropout with no engineering degree solved a problem that teams of credentialed engineers couldn't fix. It would mean explaining why we didn't think of it first. It's politically easier to pretend it never happened. Eddie asked if that meant his Bronze Star was for nothing. Hammond said no, the medal was real, but the reason for it would stay classified for at least 30 years. Maybe forever. Eddie went back to Tulsa and never talked about the war again. His kids grew up not knowing their father had changed military history. His customers never knew the quiet mechanic who fixed their Chevrolets had once outsmarted the German high command. Eddie died in 1987 at age 66 from lung cancer, probably from years of breathing engine fumes without proper ventilation. His obituary in the Tulsa World mentioned he was a World War II veteran and Bronze Star recipient. It didn't mention Sherman tanks or mud, or the modification that shortened the war. 3 people attended his funeral. One was his daughter, who found a box of papers in his garage afterward with technical drawings, Army commendations, and photographs of modified Shermans she'd never seen before. But that wasn't the end of Eddie's story. It was just the end of Eddie's chapter. Because the legacy of his modification lived on in ways he never knew about. The twin-engine Sherman modification was officially discontinued in 1946, when the Army standardized on new tank designs for the post-war era. But the principle behind Eddie's work, low RPM torque optimization for adverse terrain, became foundational to American tank design. The M26 Pershing, which replaced the Sherman, used a Ford GAF V8 engine specifically selected for better low-end torque characteristics. The M46 Patton that followed incorporated dual-path cooling systems, inspired by Eddie's jury-rigged radiator configurations. By the Korean War in 1950, every American tank incorporated some element of the lessons Eddie had proven in French mud. The engineers who designed them never credited a mechanic from Tulsa, but his fingerprints were all over their work. The Soviet Union learned about the modification through captured German intelligence reports and applied similar principles to the T-54 tank development program. British engineers studied declassified American reports in 1958 and incorporated low-speed torque optimization into the Chieftain tank design. By the 1960s, every major military power had learned the lesson. Eddie taught horsepower specifications matter less than torque delivery in actual combat conditions. The total impact was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1944 and 1990, tank designs influenced by Eddie's modification principles saved between 12,000 and 15,000 lives across multiple conflicts and nations by reducing mechanical failures in combat conditions. That's a small city worth of people who lived because a mechanic in Normandy refused to accept that mud should kill American soldiers. The modification even influenced civilian engineering. In 1967, Caterpillar developed a heavy equipment line specifically designed for low-speed, high-torque operation in adverse terrain. The chief engineer on that project was a Korean War veteran who'd commanded a Sherman variant and remembered the modified engines from training manuals. He applied the same principles to bulldozers and excavators. Those machines built highways, dug foundations, and literally reshaped landscapes. Eddie's wartime innovation echoed through peacetime construction for decades. Modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams use gas turbine engines that seem completely different from Eddie's truck motors, but they're designed around the same core principle: sustained power delivery at variable speeds under maximum load. The Abrams can idle at 900 RPM and still move 70 tons of tank smoothly, exactly like Eddie's modified Shermans could idle at 800 RPM and pull through mud. The engineering is sophisticated now, computer-controlled and precision-built. But the fundamental insight came from a guy with a wrench and a crazy idea in 1944. In 2003, American tanks in Iraq operated in desert sand and urban rubble, using engine management principles that Eddie had proven in French mud 59 years earlier. The mechanics maintaining those tanks had no idea they were benefiting from innovations by a master sergeant who died thinking his work had been forgotten. But here's the lesson that matters more than the technical legacy. Eddie Price's story is about every person who's ever had an idea that seemed crazy to everyone else. It's about the battle that happens before the battle, when you have to convince people to let you try. It's about the courage required to be wrong publicly, to risk failure when everyone is watching, to trust your own judgment against institutional wisdom. Eddie faced 3 wars. The first against German defenders, the second against American bureaucracy, the third against his own doubt. He won all 3, not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because he refused to accept that the status quo was good enough when people were dying. History is full of Eddie Prices. The radar operator who suggested using aluminum foil strips to confuse German radar, creating what became known as chaff, saving hundreds of bomber crews. The Navy cook who invented a better damage control technique during Pearl Harbor that became standard training. The infantry private who designed an improvised explosive that cleared German minefields faster, shortening the Italian campaign. All of them faced the same challenges. All of them were told their ideas were stupid, dangerous, or impossible. All of them were right anyway. The pattern repeats in every organization, military or civilian. Good ideas come from unexpected places. Systems resist change, even when change saves lives or money. The person brave enough to challenge the system gets punished ignored, or forgotten, until they're proven right. Then suddenly, everyone knew it was a good idea all along. Which brings us to the modern world. Right now, somewhere, someone has an idea that could save lives, improve efficiency, or solve a problem everyone else has accepted as unsolvable. They're probably not a senior engineer or a credentialed expert. They're probably a worker, a technician, someone close enough to the problem to see what the managers miss. And they're probably being told no. Eddie Price's story matters because it's proof that those people might be right. That credentials and experience and institutional knowledge aren't the only path to innovation. That sometimes the best solution comes from someone who doesn't know enough to realize the problem is supposed to be unsolvable. The companies, militaries, and organizations that figure out how to listen to their Eddie Prices will beat the ones that don't. It's that simple. But here's the part of Eddie's story that almost nobody knows. The detail that only came out when classified documents were finally declassified in 2004, 17 years after Eddie died. Remember Colonel Webb, the logistics officer who tried so hard to shut down Eddie's modification? The man who filed complaint after complaint, who demanded reviews and recalls, who argued that regulations mattered more than results. Webb's personnel file was opened in 2004 as part of routine declassification. Buried in his service record was an efficiency report from 1946. It noted that Colonel Harrison Webb had been passed over for promotion to general officer rank specifically because of his role in attempting to block the Sherman modification program. The review board determined that Webb had demonstrated unwillingness to adapt to field conditions and prioritized procedural compliance over operational effectiveness. His career plateaued. He retired as a colonel in 1955 and died in 1979, bitter that his 30 years of service had never earned him a general's star. The reason was classified until 2004. Here's the twist. Webb wasn't wrong about the regulations. Eddie had violated proper procedures. The modification should have gone through proper channels. Webb was following the rules exactly as written. But the rules were designed for peacetime production, not wartime innovation. Webb couldn't see the difference between rules that protected safety and rules that protected bureaucracy. The Army, to its credit, eventually figured out which kind of rules mattered. But they never told Webb. They just stopped promoting him and let him wonder why his career stalled. Meanwhile, the modification he'd tried to kill became standard teaching at Army engineering schools by 1958, taught to thousands of officers who never learned it came from a sergeant with no degree who broke every regulation Webb cared about. The original prototype Sherman that Eddie modified, the one cobbled together from salvaged parts in a maintenance shed, sat in a French salvage yard until 1947, when it was scrapped for metal. Nobody thought to preserve it. The first tank that proved the modification worked, that crossed impossible mud while generals watched, was cut apart and melted down because the paperwork listed it as a Category F total loss. The most important Sherman of World War II became rebar and car parts. That feels appropriate somehow. From a 23-year-old motor pool mechanic with a crazy idea to the modification that changed armored warfare and saved thousands of lives. Eddie Price proved that innovation doesn't require credentials, just courage to try when everyone says you're wrong. His twin-engine Shermans crossed terrain that shouldn't be crossable, won battles that shouldn't be winnable, and shortened World War II by an estimated 2 months. Between 1944 and 1990, tank designs influenced by his principles saved approximately 15,000 lives across multiple wars and nations. But Eddie died in a Tulsa garage in 1987, thinking his work had been forgotten and his sacrifice unrecognized. He never knew that every modern tank incorporates lessons he taught. He never knew that engineering students at West Point study his modification as an example of field innovation. He never knew that in 2019, a French museum finally erected a plaque at the site where his first modified Sherman crossed the impossible mud, commemorating the American mechanic who changed tank warfare with truck engines and stubbornness. The plaque calls him a genius. Eddie would have called himself a guy who couldn't stand watching his friends die in stuck tanks. Maybe both are true. Maybe that's what genius looks like: seeing a problem everyone else accepts, refusing to accept it, and being brave enough to try something that might fail spectacularly in front of everyone who said you were wrong. The next time someone tells you an idea is too crazy to work, too simple to matter, or too unorthodox to try, remember Eddie Price. Remember that the best solutions sometimes come from the people closest to the problem. Remember that courage isn't just about facing the enemy. Sometimes it's about facing your own chain of command with a wrench and an idea they'll call stupid until it saves their lives. And remember that 800 American soldiers came home from World War II because one mechanic refused to accept that mud should be a death sentence. That's not just a war story. That's the power of one person who refused to quit. If you know similar stories of unlikely heroes who changed history through pure stubbornness and innovation, share them in the comments. The world needs more Eddie Prices. And if this story taught you something or made you think differently about innovation and courage, hit subscribe, because history is full of these moments where ordinary people did extraordinary things and then disappeared back into ordinary lives, unknown and unrecognized, but absolutely essential. Eddie Price changed the world. Then he went home and fixed Chevrolets. Both mattered. Both were necessary. Both were heroic in their own way. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't remembered by anyone except the people who survived because of them. And maybe that's enough.